Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The outgoing director of military intelligence for the Israel Defense Forces, Major General Tamir Hayman, reiterated last week an assessment he made public at the turn of the year. General Hayman, who under the Israeli system is charged with overall national assessment and not only the military one, insisted that Iran remains at least 2 years away from acquiring nuclear weapons and is yet to decide on such action. It is careful to make progress on certain routes, notably research and development in accumulating high enriched uranium, but not on others. Based on this assumption, a plausible interpretation is that Iran wants to improve its position in a revived and revised Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a new nuclear deal with the United States and other world powers. Are we about to see these talks launched, and what is to be expected in them? Joining us from the U.S. coastal city of New York is Dr. Olli Heinonen, who is the former Deputy Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency and a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
Also joining us from elsewhere here in Jerusalem is Dr. Nir Bohms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
Good to be here.
Indeed, and with us here in the studio is our TV7 analyst and host of TV7's Watchmen Talk, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us an understanding on the latest developments pertaining to Iran's nuclear program, the negotiations which remain stalled to date, yet there are signals from the Iranians with no specifics, of course, with regard to possibly reviving the talks in Vienna.
Well, General Hayman, whom you quoted, relinquished his important post on the very anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which is well remembered in Israel even after 48 years as the epitome of an intelligence failure. So he is obviously aware of the problem of trying to estimate what a hostile power such as Iran has, what is it capable of, and what its intentions are. But having said that, and because there are frequent reports about Iran's breakout time, which Olli and Nir will also probably allude to, Hayman was careful to note that if you take all of the routes to the bomb together, Iran is still 2 years away from that. And by that he meant that if, for instance, one could take in one's hand or in a plastic bag enriched uranium and run off and throw it like a bomb, yes, they are only a few weeks away. But because you have to weaponize, because you have to marry it to a plane or a missile, and because of some other considerations, one should not be so alarmed yet. Yes, he thinks that Iran is Israel's major security problem. Yes, he became more anti-Iran, as he put it, while on duty. But he thinks that there is still time to see whether the new nuclear deal is in the offing. Let me make one other remark. 6 years ago, when the deal was struck, China and the United States were not so competitive with each other. Yes, they were under the Obama administration, they were not the best of friends, but there was not such overt hostility having to do with trade, with Taiwan and other issues. And it's a pity that now, with China having leverage over Iran, the United States does not have leverage over China to use its own leverage over Tehran.
Well, leverage is, of course, a matter of perspective, and each side can utilize their own tools. But with regard to General Hayman, of course, it is based on the assumption that Israel has all of the information at hand and that Iran is not disguising additional operations in areas that are unknown to Israel, as was the case in a specific nuclear reactor uncovered not necessarily by Israel, but by another country to the west.
You're going back to Donald Rumsfeld's known unknowns and unknown knowns.
So there are plenty of variables here, but I'd like to bring in Dr. Heinonen into the discussion. Dr. Heinonen, if you identify the various components at hand within Iran's capacity to do to produce at least enough fissile material for one nuclear weapon. How far is Iran away from such a quantity, if you will? And does it have the other pillars which you have spoken about frequently in the past? Are those pillars of the means of delivery, if you will, the ballistic missiles and the other components necessary in order to establish a precision-guided munition that would deliver a nuclear warhead?
Thank you. When I look at the statement of Honorable General, I wonder whether it's more political in nature than a technical, and to calm the atmosphere in Israel so that no pressures come to unnecessary actions. Because from the technical point of view, and looking back to the history, first of all, we have to remember that this parliamentary law, which is in Iran, requires the Atomic Energy Organization to install 1000 IR 2M centrifuges by the end of the year. That's 3 months away. That will be a tremendous game changer if they do so. But meanwhile, they are accumulating these higher enrichments, which have cut the current breakout time to 1 month, or about that. Well, certainly with one package of high-enriched uranium, you cannot do very much. But it starts a very different ballgame, because then people know that they have enough fissile material for one nuclear weapon. And then come these uncertainties, unknowns, known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And we really don't know how well they are prepared, which kind of assistance they got in the past. And if we look at history, just let's go back to summer 1945, when the US was finalizing its first nuclear weapons. It was somewhere in June, July, when they had enough fissile material for the weapon for Hiroshima. The weapon components had been tested, but not a weapon as a system. And a couple of months later, it was dropped. So certainly it was much more simpler device than implosion device. But there is also a huge difference. Today, the knowledge on implosion device is in public, and even rogue states are in a much better position to build it. So we should not rely too much on this kind of 2-year time frames, because once this material is out of sight, they start to use it to torture. We never know exactly where they are. So I would be very cautious just to rely on that and believe at the same time that we know everything.
Indeed. Dr. Bohms, I'd like to hear your perspective on this, but if you may also add on the fact that it seems like Iran is positioning itself to re-engage in dialogue, if you will, in Vienna, but from a position of strength, where it is rushing towards a bomb, and unless it receives what it wants, it will not relent. How do you see this?
Well, that's certainly the dynamic that we see. And just to add to the last note of Dr. Hayman, we've seen this dispute over the Tessa Kharaj site with the IAEA, where on the one hand they were allowed to come into some of the sites and to replace the hardware and equipment that was very much overdue. And at the same token, in some of the sites, it was clear that they're not welcome. And it's not entirely clear that we know what is happening there. So there's certainly more than meets the eye. Iran seems to have had some good moments in the last few months, certainly when it comes to Afghanistan, and then a little bit more when it comes to Russia and China. The Iranians were quick to say that what had happened in Afghanistan was not a U.S. withdrawal, but a U.S. defeat. The Americans were driven out. They are keeping and maintaining good relationships with the Chinese and also with the Russians. And all of that is a front that helps on the one hand with what may happen now in Vienna, and certainly sends a signal to the Americans when they come to negotiate with them. The interest obviously lies on the other side. And therefore, when the Americans come to Vienna, the question remains, what will they be able to do if the Iranians are showing a position of strength? And they're saying, look, this is a hard line. We're certainly not going to be doing exactly what was done before. And what was done before was not giving us much progress, a much more hardline position, a new President Ibrahim Raisi that doesn't have much faith or trust in America and in the negotiations overall. And then they basically says, look, we're now maybe able to get on our own. And the challenge as well is that if there's going to be a deal reached, as President Biden said, it should be a better deal. And part of this being a better deal, it has to deal with some of the other dimensions beyond the nuclear progress itself. It has to do with the ballistic missiles and with Iran's regional influence, a number of other factors that, of course, Iran is not coming to the table with much will to compromise upon. So on the one hand, Iran very much needs the sanctions relief. This is a very big part of their demand. On the other hand, the Americans would like to see a better deal reached, but the positions of the sides are fairly further away. And the fact that Iran comes stronger to the table does not, to my opinion, adds to the chances that this negotiations will actually succeed.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, Iran coming with a demand, as was reported by Iranian state media in the interview with Foreign Minister Hossein Abdullahian, that it demanded $10 billion of the United States. I mean, it seems like they're desperate for some kind of relief, at least to save face, but it seems like that the fiscal debt accumulating in Iran is bringing it to its knees. But at the same time, it has plenty of other routes of strategy to pursue vis-a-vis the West. One of those issues is, of course, its regional dimensions and the policy exerted there. Nonetheless, to what degree do you think that it is resolved in returning to negotiations, and will it do so in good faith, or will it be just a step in the direction of trying to, get the West so-called off its back?
Well, putting the terms Iran and good faith in the same sentence is quite a leap. Interest is what will dictate their approach. Now, the $10 billion tag, which you mentioned, is extortion born out of desperation. Obviously, they need the money, and they need to show their population that they have gotten some relief and that the trend is going to be positive from now on. And of course, the Iranians will try to squeeze whatever concessions they can before they go back to negotiations. These are two stages of basically the same bargaining ploy. First, you pay for being part of the game, and then comes the game itself. But, I'm not an expert on beer consumption, but it stands to reason that if you want to get smashed, one beer will not be enough. You need at least a six-pack. If Iran wants to go nuclear, one bomb is worse for it than none. Because if it has a bomb, yes, it's a record. It's like Columbus reaching the New World, Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier, and several such firsts. But all it will do is bring the wrath of Israel and the United States and the rest upon it. So it must find a way, once it wants to break out, to have an arsenal, not just a single warhead. And it seems beyond its powers right now, so it stands to reason, at least our reasoning, that it is on its way back to the table.
With that being said, of course, there remain outstanding questions regarding undeclared nuclear materials that were uncovered by IAEA inspectors in Tehran. Dr. Heinonen, can the IAEA provide assurances to the international community on Iran's compliance with any nuclear deal at a time when it cannot even secure answers that add up, as the Director General of the IAEA mentioned, Rafael Mariano Grossi, with regard to Iranian answers that were blatant lies, if you will? how can the agency confirm Iran's compliance if it cannot even manage to confirm that it's not dealing with undeclared activities?
It's actually not up to the IAEA Secretariat. It's up to the member states and particularly the Board of Governors and the UN Security Council. They should provide necessary legal authorization for the IAEA to do its job and not just sit on the fence and look when Iran proceeds with its enrichment and possibly with the clandestine locations. And this gap between last year's resolution, June last year versus this year on these unresolved issues, shows that the international community has selected this kind of approach of watching what happens. And this certainly frustrates Director General Grossi because he wants to do his job. And under current circumstances, he's not positioned to implement it. And the end result, it will be less credible IAEA verification regime. That's one thing. It sets a precedent not only to Iran for further actions, but to the international community in general, that IAEA has currently, in the current political environment, tremendous limitations to do its core mission. This is what I would say, and that's what is in the stake.
Indeed. And Dr. Bohms, when we're looking at the way Iran has been demonizing the IAEA, claiming it has become politicized by Israel and the United States in order to advance its own interests in the Iranian nuclear program or to try and thwart Iran from having such a program, do you think the Iranians are doing this in order to somehow detach itself from responsibilities or outcomes that may be produced by the international agency?
Well, that's certainly a good reason or excuse to use if we're not reaching an agreement. Another way to say all options are open on our hand. It's also a very good technique if you wish to strengthen your own hand in a negotiation, saying that the adversaries have false claims and this is all politically motivated and therefore you should not listen to the intelligence report, for example, that are given to you by the Israelis. The Iranians are not lazy. I mean, we sometimes tend to think that you have a very isolated country that is just engaging in a certain way occasionally in Vienna, but that's not the case. I mean, the Iranians have been very busy. They had meetings with the Saudis, they had meetings in Qatar, they obviously have meetings with Russia and with China and with other partners. So they're very busy lobbying, not just for the JCPOA, broadly for their interests and their regional hegemony. And in that sense, they're preparing themselves for two ways. Either they will succeed, because in some ways the American traditional approach, not under the previous administration, but certainly before it, was that the United States did not necessarily wish to find itself in a scenario that brings additional conflict, and it wished to avoid them by bringing diplomacy to the table. That certainly still is the European approach. We've heard it from the Europeans recently, just a week and a bit more ago at the United Nations with Joseph Borrell. Diplomacy is the answer for all of these issues, and therefore we need to negotiate. We need to come back to the old JCPOA or to a slightly renewed framework, and in that sense, buy ourselves some time and quiet, resolve the nuclear issue to a certain degree, and the other issues are less important because the original framework of the JCPOA did not cover them. That's
I think though it's
that certainly is a problem from when it comes to an Israeli perspective.
I think it's important, though, to make a clear distinction between EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, who is the administrator of this talks in Vienna, as opposed to the E3, who are losing patience, who have stated this on multiple occasions, who are frustrated with additional demands coming out of Tehran, and with France, which is quite adamant on a JCPOA plus, as is Great Britain. Germany is a different story, of course, but Mr. Owen, when we're looking at the whole picture, Can the international community guarantee that Iran is not accumulating enough material for a nuclear weapon behind the scenes? Once again, the ifs and hows and wheres and whats, taking this out of the equation, practically speaking, what are the guarantees that Israel can have, and to what degree should it prepare for the day in which it suddenly finds out that it was wrong?
Well, Israel should obviously be prepared to take action, even though if this action is taken by aircraft, these are all American-made, and there will be the expectation in Washington that Israel will consult with Washington, because for the Iranians it will inevitably be an Israeli-American joint action.
As was earlier this week, of course, the meeting between Jake Sullivan and Khulata, the national security advisors of the United States, and Israel, in which they were discussing a plan B. They were discussing what if Iran doesn't return to nuclear diplomacy for that matter, and then what would be the reaction of the United States, Israel, and its like-minded nations?
Well, this was the way it was described in Israel, but it seems as if it was an Israeli plan B, which was marketed to the Biden administration, not necessarily signed off on by Biden. But, the Iranians, even though it's for their tactical advantage, have a case politically in saying, how can we be sure that whatever we sign with Biden will still be binding if Trump goes back to office, or even if the Republicans take Congress next year? In Iran, of course, there is continuity under the Ayatollahs, specifically under Khamenei. But in the United States, a democracy, the next president or the next Congress can change whatever the incumbents do. There will be probably an agreement between the Americans and the Iranians, and Israel can try to improve it at the margins, looking from its own perspective, but it cannot be responsible for aborting it.
But you're speaking about guarantees. There are no guarantees. If the Trump administration potentially retakes office in a couple of years.
Well, there was a debate behind the scenes some 55, 60 years ago between Jerusalem and Washington on the question of guarantees. And what the Kennedy and then the Johnson administration told Prime Ministers Ben-Gurion and Eshkol is that, listen, you don't need what you call a deterrent. We all know what they meant. If push comes to shove, if Nasser attacks, we guarantee that the Sixth Fleet will be over. But they were told, yes, by the time you get here, it will all be over before you come over. So what good is a guarantee in the time frame in which a nuclear strike from Iran takes place? Israel, of course, will take care of its own, but it prefers that the international community does before it must do what it must.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to receive perspective, speculation, of course, but still informed analysis. Dr. Heinonen, where are things heading from here? Are we expected to see a resumption of talks and ultimately a JCPOA potentially plus, or the way it was in the past, about 1.5 minutes, if you may?
Doesn't look very promising at this point of time, certainly the talks. And I think that they might come in a very difficult time if we follow this Iranian foreign minister's term. Talks start soon, and then people speculate that might be in November. The nuclear program is in a very different situation in November, and as was mentioned by previous speakers, Iranians are going to speak from the strength to that end. And I think it would be difficult to get them without any conditions to the table, particularly now that they have gone out and said that we need some catering of the table with $10 billion. It's very difficult to remove back from that position and say, okay, actually it doesn't matter, let's talk. Yeah. And then we have this looming deadline of additional centrifuges to be installed. So we will be in a very difficult position with the talks. And then is the acceptance here in the US and in the Congress. We have to remember that Mr. Biden is also tied with his hands to the previous legislation, because any deal what he writes with Iran is subject to approval by the Congress.
Indeed.
And there is no bipartisan support at this point of time, I'm sure, which will get him over this 60 votes in Senate threshold. So there are a lot of uncertainties waiting us, but at least let's hope that the talks start and then see how it goes from there. But I'm not overly optimistic that there's any solution anytime soon.
Indeed, plenty of obstacles. Dr. Bohm, do you have less than a minute?
I'll just say that regardless if we're going to have an agreement or we're not going to have an agreement, what I think this whole office does is increases the numbers in some of the reports that we see regarding the weapons exchange that market has reached $3 trillion last year's in military expenditure. It basically sends a very clear signal that the Middle East continues to be not very stable, that agreements may not necessarily be kept, that the Americans may be going out, that the Iranians, with or without an agreement, are going to continue to be belligerent. And it sends a very clear signal to all those around them that one of the things they need to do is to continue an arms race. And this is something that can be very, very dangerous for the future.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. Despite the bleak assessments, hopefully we'll have a similar show in the near future that we'll be able to be more optimistic about. But I'd like to thank, it's always a pleasure, Dr. Hayman and Dr. Bohm, thank you so very much. And I'd like to thank our TV7 analyst, Mr. Milovan, as well, and to thank all of you at home for being part of today's panel by viewing, and we will see you next time.